a hand curled inward, resting on a chest that no longer rises. Around it, someone has placed a handful of flowers, crushed now, their pollen pressed into sediment that will outlast every bone in that grave by tens of thousands of years. No one recorded this moment. No one wrote a name. And yet somehow, across an unthinkable stretch of time, this single gesture survived long enough for scientists to find it. Someone stayed. That is the strange part. Not that a body was left somewhere, that someone chose not to leave it. For most of the animal kingdom, death simply happens and then it is over. A body falls, the world moves on. There is no ceremony, no waiting, no arrangement of the limbs. But somewhere in our past, something changed. You already know what death looks like. You have felt the stillness in a room where breathing has stopped, the particular silence that follows. What you may not know is that this refusal to simply walk away might be one of the oldest fingerprints of the human mind, older than most people assume. For decades, researchers believed deliberate burial began with us, with anatomically modern humans. Sometime after clever tools and cave paintings marked the arrival of full self-awareness. It fit a comfortable story. Only a mind capable of abstract thought could look at a corpse and understand that something irreversible had occurred. Then, a discovery in a South African cave complicated that story, and the field has been arguing about it ever since. Deep inside a chamber so narrow that only a small-bodied person could squeeze through it, researchers found the remains of more than a dozen individuals belonging to Homo naledi, a species with a brain roughly a third the size of ours. If the bodies had been placed there deliberately, rather than swept in by water or dragged in by predators, it would mean something unsettling. Confronting death might not depend on the size of a brain at all. That is a significant if. Many paleoanthropologists remain openly skeptical. Caves collect bodies in ways that can mimic intention without any intention existing at all. Water finds cracks. Predators drag prey into shelter. The debate over Homo naledi is still very much alive, and no single cave settles it. But suppose for a moment that the skeptics are wrong. Suppose a small-brained hominin really did carry its dead into darkness on purpose. Then the question stops being about intelligence entirely. It becomes a question about something else. To find that something else, you have to go back further than any grave, back to the raw biological problem every social animal faces the moment one of its own stops moving. A body that no longer moves is dangerous information. It signals disease, predation, unseen threat. Among early hominins living in small, exposed groups, ignoring a corpse was often not a moral failure. It was a survival strategy. Move on, stay alert. Do not linger near a source of infection or a predator's leftover meal. So why would the opposite instinct ever take hold? Why would staying, watching, touching the dead become worth the risk? The answer may lie in something more basic than fear. It may lie in attachment. Long before language, before ritual, before any concept of an afterlife, early humans had already evolved deep social bonds essential for raising slow-growing, helpless infants. Mothers who abandoned distressed offspring did not pass on their genes as effectively as those who stayed, soothed, and protected. An attachment system built for the living may simply have had nowhere left to go once someone died. A mother chimpanzee has been observed carrying her dead infant for days, grooming it, resisting its decay, unable to fully release the behavioral patterns attachment had built into her. But eventually she lets go. She does not bury. She does not mark the spot. Humans, at some point, did something different. Picture a hunter returning to camp at dusk, the way he has 1,000 evenings before, and glancing without meaning to at the patch of ground where his brother always sat. The space is empty. He looks anyway. The body has been carried somewhere else, deliberately, hours earlier, but his eyes have not caught up with that fact yet. That gap between what the mind expects and what has actually changed may be exactly where burial behavior was born. At sites in the Levant, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, archaeologists have found bodies placed in deliberate positions, limbs arranged, red ochre scattered across bones, antlers positioned near a skull. Here, the evidence is considerably stronger than at the Naledi cave, and most researchers accept these as genuine intentional burials. Someone made choices. Someone returned to the body, perhaps more than once. Notice what that means. The dead cannot see the ochre or the careful placement of a hand. Every ritual act surrounding death was, from the very beginning, aimed at the survivors, not the deceased. This is the inversion hiding inside the entire history of burial. We tend to think of funeral rites as something owed to the dead, but they may have functioned first and foremost as a tool for the living, a way of processing an event the human mind was never built to easily accept. Some researchers who study grief describe exactly the gap that Hunter felt at his brother's empty seat. The brain, they suggest, does not immediately update its internal model of someone's existence. It keeps predicting their footsteps, their voice, their return, for a while after the world has already erased them. A grave may have offered a way to force that update. It gives absence a location. It turns a formless vanishing into something fixed in space, something that can be visited, rather than something that keeps reopening every time an old habit expects a person who is no longer there. But there may be a second layer beneath this one, reaching further back than grief itself. Once early humans began to grasp that death was not only something that happened to others, but something that would eventually happen to them too. A more dangerous problem emerged. Not sorrow, dread. Awareness of one's own mortality is, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, a liability. An animal paralyzed by existential fear does not hunt efficiently, does not plan for a future it doubts will arrive. So how did a species survive knowing, with total certainty, that it would die? One influential idea, still debated among anthropologists and psychologists, is that culture itself, ritual, storytelling, early religious belief, art, arose partly as a buffer against that unbearable knowledge. Structures suggesting continuity beyond the body, a name remembered, a story retold, a grave marked and revisited, implying an ongoing relationship that softens the finality of non-existence. It is not a settled fact, but it would explain something striking. Nearly every human culture ever documented, across wildly different geographies, languages, and belief systems, developed some form of death ritual, not because of one shared religion passed hand to hand across the world, but perhaps because the psychological weight of knowing you will die is a pressure every human society has had to answer somehow. Consider what that might mean at the largest scale. Every cemetery on Earth, every gravestone, every quiet plot of land set aside for the dead may trace its lineage back to a single behavioral shift so old it predates language itself, a shift that had nothing to do with religion when it began, and everything to do with a hunter unwilling to walk past an empty seat without looking. Now return to that South African cave, to Homo naledi, small-brained, ancient, moving through darkness with a body it may have chosen not to leave behind. If the skeptics are right, this was simply geology doing what geology does, and the story ends there, unresolved. But if the deliberate reading holds up under further evidence, then perhaps ritual around death never required philosophy at all. Perhaps it required only enough social bonding to feel an absence, and enough behavioral flexibility to act on that feeling. Either way, something has already shifted in how the instinct itself looks. The urge to attend a funeral, to bring flowers to a grave that will never receive them, to speak softly near a casket, as though the person inside might still hear you. These may not be customs passed down through polite tradition alone. They may be echoes of something older than agriculture, older than most of what we call civilization, reactivating quietly every time modern humans gather to mark a death. Scientists still debate exactly when this behavior began, and how much of it reflects symbolic thought versus something closer to instinct. The line between accident and intention in the archaeological record is not always easy to draw, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But across the sites where evidence is strongest, a pattern keeps surfacing. Wherever hominins built strong social bonds, some deliberate response to death tends to follow. which brings the story back to that single hand curled inward, resting where flowers were placed tens of thousands of years ago. That gesture was never really about the body in front of them. It was about everyone still breathing nearby, standing at the edge of an absence too large to simply step around, doing the only thing a social, attached, mortality-aware species has ever known how to do, staying a little longer than they needed to.